From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome now to Balance of Power. Well, 2 days in a row, we've got softer inflation numbers indicating maybe we're getting past that peak. So for the second day in a row, we welcome back Michael McKee. He's Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. So, Mike, as long as you keep bringing in these numbers, we're going to keep asking you back.
Well, I'm going to keep trying. Well, first, let's look at what happened today. The producer price index comes in with the first decline since April of 2020. And, of course, that was when the economy was getting smacked around by the COVID virus, so this is a significant accomplishment. It is mostly gasoline, as it was with CPI yesterday, but you can see for the Biden administration, this is all good news. We've got a decline in CPI and a decline in PPI, and unemployment continues to fall, which is not supposed to happen. The question was, would we have a recession because declining inflation would push unemployment up? So far, that's not happening. And the evidence is it's not really moving in that direction. While we did get an increase in jobless claims today, the continuing claims, the people who are still getting benefits, has not moved. Actually, it is lower than it was when the jobless claims numbers hit their low in March, which suggests if you're losing your job, it's pretty easy to find another one, which is also good news for the Fed and I guess for the Biden administration. Now the question is, where are Americans on all of this? Tomorrow we get the University of Michigan's consumer sentiment data, and this is the University of Michigan's consumer sentiment about inflation data. The dotted lines are where the Michigan numbers are, the white and blue lines that are on this screen. I know you can't see it on radio, but you can imagine it. That was, you saw us report this on Monday, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's inflation expectations numbers. And so if the Michigan numbers confirm that people are not thinking inflation's going to rise, then the Fed is going to be in pretty good shape going forward.
So you all want to tune in tomorrow to see whether Michael McKee can pull off the trifecta. He can get the third with the UMich consumer sentiment numbers. Thanks so much, Mike, for being with us today. And now we want to turn to an economist, Douglas HoltzEakin, president of the American Action Forum. Earlier, Dr. Holtz-Eakin served as director of the Congressional Budget Office. So, Doug, thanks so much for being with us. Let me give you a reaction we got yesterday from Janno Lieber, the Secretary of Commerce, to the CPI numbers before the PPI come in. This is what she said.
It is good news, although I do think we have to be cautious. A big reason for the good news, gas prices are leveling off, and that's certainly helpful to consumers. But as you point out, there are other issues like in housing that we have to still keep our eye on the ball. As we've said all along, there's no silver bullet here.
That was Janno Lieber, the Secretary of Commerce. So, Doug, let me get your reaction. Are you cautious as well? How high should our hopes be right now on the inflation front?
Yeah, I'm a little concerned about some premature spiking of the football here. It's good news that gas prices came down. That drove both the CPI and the PPI. But if you look at the consumer price index, core inflation was unchanged year over year at 5.9%, so no progress at all. Shelter price inflation, 1/3 of the CPI, was up to 5.7%, another 0.1% increase year over year. And that's been rising since January 2021, uninterrupted, no sign of abatement. So it's hard to look at that report and say, gee, we've made great progress. It looks like more of the same to me. I think it bakes in a 75-point increase by the Fed, and there's nothing about, nearly double-digit producer price inflation that should cause anyone to relax either. So this looks like an economy that remains too hot. The labor market's hot. The inflation is not abating. It's staying about the same. And we've gotten some movement in the volatile energy sector. That's not a surprise.
So at the very least, it looks like for the moment, it is one data point, two now with CPI and PPI, when at least it's not getting worse. It's not getting worse as fast as we thought. So the question in part I have is, if it is peaking, what does this curve look like on the downward slope?
So I hope it's not going to get worse. I think the real litmus test is when we get the PCE price index, the Fed's preferred measure for July. When we looked at that data in June, it accelerated. So we were going the wrong direction in June. Hopefully in July we see it turn around and start to go down, in which case inflation will have peaked. And I can see a path back to, say, 4% inflation that really doesn't look too difficult for the Fed. But from 4 to 2, it looks like heavy sledding to me. It's going to be a difficult, long process. And so I think if you're interested in full employment, price stability, where the latter is defined as 2% inflation, you've got some months, if not years, of real work ahead of you.
Well, one of my questions, Doug, is exactly what's the time horizon on the 2? I mean, it strikes me it might be different if you say 5 years to 2 as opposed to 18 months to 2.
So when Chairman Powell announced the basic framework for rate increases, portfolio shrinkage, he envisioned sort of moving as expeditiously as possible to neutral, and I think they've been trying to do that, and getting back to 2% in 3 years. And so that says something like 2025. I think that's doable. I don't think sooner than that is very likely, and I'm not sure the public has patience for longer than that. It remains to be seen.
Well, and part of my question is, assume that they can make it in 3 years to 2, what does it do to growth? That is to say, what the Fed needs to do to get us there, what does that mean potentially for growth?
I think the real issue on growth is not the cyclical piece. I, like everyone else, believe that the probability of a recession early next year, perhaps late this year, is up significantly. That the lesson of history is that the Fed finds it extremely hard to manage a soft landing, and we're quite likely to have a mild recession. I think we can recover from that mild recession with the reliance on the private sector. I don't think we're going to need any sort of big government intervention. And that then raises the question, what does growth look like after that? What is the trend rate of growth? Where will the productivity growth come from? We've had terrible productivity growth. So that's things like, investment in innovation, investment in capital, human skills, tax and regulatory policies that foster that kind of an environment. And I don't see anything on the congressional or administrative agenda that looks anything like that.
Well, it's not on the agenda anymore, but it's because it just got done. What about the Chips and Science Act? What about the Inflation Reduction Act? Because there's a fair amount of investment, including in innovation in there. Do you think that might help us some on the productivity?
So on the chips and science, I'm not a big fan of the chips. I don't see why U.S. semiconductor companies that know that Taiwan's no longer a safe place to have chips wouldn't just build their fabs with their own money somewhere else. They certainly are capable of doing that. $52 billion is not a lot of money from the perspective of what's out there in the private capital markets. So that looks like more politics and corporate welfare than anything else to me. On the other part, the science part, you can spend money. You might make some scientists better off, and the real question is what innovation we get for it. And I think the jury's still out on that. So it would be great if that did prove to be something in the way of a productivity enhancer, but I guess I'm waiting for that case to be proven as opposed to assuming it's right. And as far as the Inflation Reduction Act, it's not going to reduce inflation. While we have been debating this and watching it and talking about it every day, Congress passed the Chips and Science Act. That's $300 billion of deficit finance spending, offsetting anything that's in the IRA. They also passed a PACT Act that's $600 billion of deficit finance spending, so overwhelming whatever you get out of the IRA. So there's nothing Congress is up to that's going to help on the inflation front. And it may have done something on the innovation front, but the jury's still out. Well,
and finally, Doug, just let me ask you about that corporate welfare point that you made. $52 billion is not that much in the overall scheme of things. We had Gina Raimondo, the former Commerce Secretary, on yesterday. She thinks there's a multiplier that could be 5, 6, or even more times that it could be as much as $400 billion coming out of the 52. You've studied the economy for a long time as an economist. Is that plausible?
No. We're at full employment. And so if you multiply by 5, that $52 billion, and turn into a $250 billion outlay for semiconductors, it has to come from somewhere. That means some other part of the economy has to shrink by $250 billion. The issue is not this government reallocating the capital. The issue is getting the economy as a whole to grow so that you can accommodate both the private sector investing in fabs and doing the other things. So I find those estimates, they're convenient politically, but they're not to be believed.
Doug, it's really always so helpful to have you on with your analysis. Thank you. That's Douglas HoltzEakin of the American Action Forum. Coming up, we're going to talk with former Secretary of Defense William Cohen about Russia's war in Ukraine and tensions over Taiwan. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. To keep you up to date with news from all around the world, we turn now to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian forces lost 9 combat aircraft in Crimea this week. Speaking at an international donors conference in Copenhagen, President Zelensky called for more funding and weapons for Kyiv. Denmark and the UK, co-hosts of the meeting, each pledged more equipment. This comes as German Chancellor Olaf Scholz declared the reconstruction of Ukraine will be bigger than the post-World War II Marshall Plan. Today, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz promised a third package of financial assistance to offset surging inflation stoked by Russia's move to cut gas supplies. At his inaugural summer news conference, he hammered home his message that his government has the energy crisis under control. Nearly half of German homes rely on gas for heating. The country faces potential rationing if it fails to secure sufficient reserves this winter. Following a week of war games and military drills, China today continued its threats to attack Taiwan. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, meanwhile, defended her decision to visit Taiwan, saying the United States can't allow China to establish a new normal around the island nation.
We didn't go there to talk about China. We went there to praise Taiwan. And we went there to show our friendship, to say China cannot isolate Taiwan.
Speaker Pelosi spoke hours after Beijing announced plans for regular military patrols around the island. North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un was seriously ill during a recent COVID outbreak. That's according to his sister Kim Yo-jong. She blamed South Korea for spreading the virus by sending what she called dirty objects across the border in leaflets carried by balloons. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. We want to go deeper into two of the stories Mark just told us about. One of them is Ukraine and the other is China, and we have the perfect person to do that with. He's William Cohen, founder and chairman of the Cohen Group. Mr. Cohen, of course, served as Secretary of Defense under President Clinton, and before that, as Senator from Maine. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being with us. Let's start with Ukraine. You heard the report there. You've seen it. A report that, in fact, 9, perhaps, warplanes of Russia were destroyed in Crimea, which was a long way behind the lines, perhaps because of some of the weapon systems being supplied by the Europeans and us. What do we know about what's happening in Crimea?
It's unclear. There have been reports that it may be a special forces group of the Ukrainian military that's been able to either get close or close enough to cause that explosion. They've also tried to make it clear that it was not U.S. weapons that were involved for fear that Putin would then feel compelled to respond in a much more devastating way. He has threatened to use small nuclear arms and weapons against Ukrainian people. We're hoping he won't cross that threshold, because then it would put us in a position with our allies of judging what our response would be. And slowly we're climbing up a chain reaction that is not going to be beneficial to Russia or to the world at large.
This war has gone on a lot longer than many people expected. I'm sure longer than Vladimir Putin expected when he started out on it. Where do you think we are right now, and what tips the balance?
I think the balance will tip when Putin decides that he really can't afford to continue to lose the people that he's losing on the battlefield. When we see that Russian gas and oil will have less importance to the Europeans as they decide to take measures that will help them reduce their reliance upon Russia, so that Russia can't continue to blackmail them or use energy as a blackmail policy toward them. So I think a combination of things as he looks forward, where is this going? Europe becoming less reliant upon us. By the way, we've had 2 new countries who are going to be joining NATO, and that doesn't bode well for us. So I think he's going to have to calculate whether or not his assumption that the United States and the West would really fail to measure up and keep our sanctions in place in the long term. In other words, would we fold at the card table before he does? And I think that's still an open question at this point. I think the Europeans are showing great strength so far, that they've been able to hold together and take measures which reduce their reliance. But there's an opportunity for Russia to try to see whatever cracks are there, either in Hungary or Turkey or other countries where he can move and find some way to break that unanimity of action right now.
Secretary Cohen, let's turn to a second story we just heard about, which is continued tensions over Taiwan. Obviously, this is in the aftermath of Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, but I'd love your sense about our preparation to really deal with Taiwan. None of us want an armed conflict, either with Taiwan and China or with us and China, goodness knows. At the same time, in order to avoid it, perhaps we have to be prepared for it. I've read various accounts, including from RAND Corporation, of various war games that have done that basically have U.S. losing a direct conflict with China much more often than we win it in the war games. Is that right?
Well, there's a chance of that. There are recent studies which show that the United States would actually win, but these are all tabletop exercises, so-called wargaming it out. China has come a very long way in the last 4 decades. They came from a country that was simply unprepared to conduct any kind of massive military operations. As we saw in their reaction to Speaker Pelosi's trip, they have very sophisticated equipment now. I would say they're a peer competitor, certainly on the economic level, but now I believe at the military level. So we have to be concerned about their progress and make sure that we stay ahead of them as best we can by investing in new technologies and capabilities that we need to have to be able to say, do not make a military move against Taiwan. We want to have that one China policy and still make sure that you don't try to take over Taiwan by the threat of force or the use of force.
Secretary Cohen, you mentioned technology. Let me ask you one specific question. What about long-range anti-ship missiles? Again, this is to avoid a conflict, but sometimes the way to avoid it is to deter it.
Well, I think our ships are certainly at risk for long-range missiles, hypersonic missiles that the Chinese have developed and that we are working very assiduously on as well. Anytime you have a long-range missile, it can evade detection until it's too late to respond to it. So I think that kind of technology is something that we have to not only build offensively, but also prepare defenses for it. Just one final comment about China. The outrage that we've seen expressed by the Chinese was foreseen and foreseeable. We also wanted to make clear to the Chinese that not to use force. But here's the situation we have. We want to have allies on our side in the event we should ever come to any kind of a conflict with China. Those allies don't want to be forced to choose between China and us because they're in the neighborhood and we are not. So when the best way we can hold on to our allies is to make sure we're not seen as provoking a conflict in the region. If China continues to overreact and to continue exercises or to really flout their power, that will do more to galvanize support for the United States than anything else the Chinese can do. So as long as China is seen as an aggressor and continues to be provocative in its own right, our allies will be with us. If we, on the other hand, are seen as poking a finger in the eye of Xi Jinping and the Chinese, I think they'll be less likely to want to be supporting us should a conflict come.
That's a fascinating perspective. Mr. Secretary, let me ask you just one last question on a different subject. Obviously, there's been a lot of coverage this week about that search warrant executed by FBI agents down at Mar-a-Lago, former President Trump's residence. What about the national security potential implications here? We don't know what that warrant was for. We don't know what was there, but some of the reporting is potentially that the former president took with him some very highly classified documents. If that's true, what does that mean for national security issues?
It means that information might be available to adversaries or others who mean us harm. Former President Trump is exactly that, a former president. He's a citizen. He's not a president who has the ability or the law-abiding notion that he can hold on to classified documents. He has to turn all of that over to the American people. It has to be archived. It has to be protected. And the notion that somehow he might still have that information, that in itself would constitute a crime in my judgment. So to the extent we don't know what the request was, by the way, President Trump, former President Trump, could clear things up. Right. He could release the search warrant and say, here's what they were after. I don't think he wants to do that, and we certainly don't want to do that. If the Justice Department were to release that, it would look like we are really just discriminating against President Trump should he ever come to trial. So there's a way to clear it up, but I think we need patience and have some reliance upon our Attorney General as a meticulous, very prudent, thoughtful former jurist who would not easily sign off on something unless there's something there.
Excellent point. Thank you so much. Secretary William Cohen, for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Still to come, we're going to talk with Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison about how his state is addressing election challenges, abortion rights, and law enforcement. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. I want to take a look at the markets today. And I must say, when those PPI numbers came out this morning, I thought it was going to be a big risk-on day for the markets. Now, as we get to the noon hour, not so much. Abigail Doolittle is here to explain.
Yeah, it could be a little bit of consolidating yesterday's big gains and the big surprise relative to CPI. People, traders are a little bit tired. We have the S&P 500 right now up about 0.3%. Earlier, it had been significantly higher, up closer to 1%. And the reason I say investors, traders are tired, volume is below the 20-day average. And at the lows, not hugely below, but 8% below at the lows right now, about 3% below. But this is a way of saying, yes, the PPI confirmed the CPI print and the idea that the Fed has a little bit of breathing room, and so do traders on this day. They're just taking a little bit of a break here at this point.
But so one of the things we're all looking at is oil and gas, because when the CPI came in, we were told, including by Gina Raimondo, Secretary of Commerce, part of it's because gas prices are down. What are we expecting there?
Well, that is certainly a relief that gas prices are down, but it's interesting because we have oil higher, and that, of course, has to do with the IEA, but it's positive because the IEA is talking about demand growth, which suggests maybe that this recession everybody's fearing is not around as much. Plus, we have the dollar down. You always ask me about the dollar, and that's why I was looking at it yesterday, which yesterday was the worst day since March of 2020, down 4 days in a row. If we continue to see weakness in the dollar, even though risk assets right now are just sort of mixed, small moves to the upside and the downside, if we can continue to see a weak dollar, that's going to help out the risk assets, making reason to think that this bear market rally will continue.
I got to sneak in one more. My old shop, I used to work for them, Disney. They really surprised yesterday.
Great quarter, right across the board. Sales, profits they beat, and then also the big one, subscribers. The third quarter in a row, 14.4 million subscribers. Plus, and you would know more about this than me, they're managing to raise prices by 38%. Disney World also doing well, so stay at home.
Yeah. David Zaslav. So what David Zaslav wants to do is charge for that streaming. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. To keep you up to date with all the news from all around the world, we turn now to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. Today, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz promised a third package of financial assistance to offset surging inflation stoked by Russia's move to cut gas supplies. At his inaugural summer news conference, Scholz hammered home that message that his government has the energy crisis under control.
I summed it up with the phrase, "You'll never walk alone," and I want to repeat that here again. We will do everything to ensure that the citizens get through this difficult time.
Chancellor Scholz warned that the coming months will be challenging for Europe's biggest economy. Nearly half of German homes rely on gas for heating. The country faces potential rationing if it fails to secure sufficient reserves this winter. OPEC expects global oil markets to tip into surplus this quarter. The cartel cut forecast for the amount of crude it will need to pump in the third quarter by 1.2 million barrels a day. OPEC's outlook may give more insight into the minimal production increase it agreed on last week with its allies. The number of student visas given to Chinese nationals has fallen by more than half compared with pre-pandemic levels. That's according to the Wall Street Journal, citing State Department data. The drop hurts finances at state universities, since Chinese students pay out-of-state tuition. The decline is blamed in part on the students' doubts that they will be welcome in the United States. Republicans vow they'll waste no time tearing into the FBI search of Donald Trump's home and other investigations of the former president if the GOP wins control of Congress in November. GOP lawmakers and committee chairmen in waiting have already pledged to hold aggressive hearings and issue subpoenas. Republicans are expected to take the House and have a decent chance of taking the Senate majority in the midterm elections. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists, analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, the job of being a state attorney general has always been a big one, but in recent days it seems to have gotten just that much bigger with so many pressing legal issues, often now told by the United States Supreme Court should be handled by the states. We welcome now one of those state attorneys general. He is Keith Ellison, Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. So, Mr. Attorney General, thank you so much for being with us. I'd love to go through some of the issues that I think are important in a lot of the states. And let's start with election integrity, as it's called, and some of the presses to change the way voting is done. What's going on in Minnesota?
Well, in Minnesota, we have the highest voter turnout in the United States. We've had it for many years. It's not a one-off. It's a consistent thing. And it's because people believe that our election system is strong. They believe that it has integrity. They believe that their vote matters. And we also do a lot of things to make sure that that is true, such as same-day voter registration. You don't have to have a reason to vote early. You can vote by mail. And all these things give us an advantage in trying to make sure that everybody participates. On the other hand, as Attorney General, we've had some folks who threatened to come to our state to stand around polling sites with guns. And I, relying on Minnesota and federal law, said, if you do that, we're going to sue you. They entered into some consent decrees with me to make sure that they did not do that voter intimidation tactic. We are prepared to do that and more in the upcoming election. From the standpoint of election integrity, vote for whoever you want to vote for. But we won't tolerate people being intimidated at the polls. People are going to make an unrestrained, free choice to vote for whoever they choose. That's what we believe in.
Mr. Attorney General, we saw a lot of litigation coming out of the 2020 presidential election. Looking forward to the 2024 election now, putting aside for a moment the midterms. What can you do, if anything, to sort of anticipate that litigation to make sure that it doesn't upset an election?
Well, we have a team scrutinizing these issues. And we are in touch with our partners around the country. We're making sure that we're challenging laws that are in violation of the Voting Rights Act and the U.S. Constitution and state constitutions. We're making sure that people are volunteering, that young people are coming and getting involved. Look, elections are highly contested events these days. They always have been in America. That's not a bad thing. We want people to want to participate. But it's got to be fair, and it can. And we don't. We're not going to tolerate voter suppression efforts. And so we just got to be vigilant and alert, and remember that it's a good thing in a democratic society for people to vote.
Another pressing legal issue is, of course, abortion, with the Supreme Court in the Dunn decision basically saying it's up to the states to decide what's done. What is the status of abortion rights in Minnesota, and are there efforts to change that?
Well, we are an island. In Minnesota, you have the right to get a safe legal abortion. You have to go all the way to Illinois to find that again. So we are a state where women in Minnesota can get a safe legal abortion, but in Wisconsin, Iowa, North and South Dakota, and other states around us, that right is restrained. And we are seeing an influx of people coming here to assert their constitutional rights in Minnesota. What I have said is that if any woman comes here to get an abortion, that if they are prosecuted in another state, we will intervene in that state to say that people can come to Minnesota, they can travel, a right to travel, and have a right to do what is legal to do in Minnesota. That goes for providers in Minnesota. And we will resist any extradition effort from any state when they try to interfere with people's safe legal right to have an abortion under Minnesota law. Yes, it's being contested. We have an election in November, and the Republican gubernatorial candidates, lieutenant governor candidates, my opponent in the attorney general's race, are all threatening to deprive women of the right to an abortion. And we are stalwart in saying that, no, we're going to protect that right here. But so that's something for the voters to decide. Do they want a statewide elected officials who are going to protect their rights? Or do they want people who will take them away? I think people want their rights.
A final issue here, Mr. Attorney General, and that's law enforcement and efforts to reform. So law enforcement, obviously there were efforts made at the Congress. They did not go forward this year. What is the situation in Minnesota right now with respect to reform of law enforcement?
Well, let me tell you, I just want to say hats off to the men and women of law enforcement who protect folks every single day. They do a great service, and the overwhelming number of them do that with honor and dignity. For the ones who don't, like, say, Derek Chauvin, for example, it is important that we reform the system. It's not a simple matter. Of course, we need accountability for people who violate the law, who happen to wear a badge, but we also need to improve systems too. Today I've been working with folks on this issue of mental health. A large number of people who are killed in deadly force encounters with police are suffering in a mental health crisis. We need to be able to assist police departments by having things like joint responses, by having more mental health services available to people, by making sure that people are getting treatment. And so it is an overall reform effort, but I'm glad to say that it's on. I am still disappointed that we don't have a George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed. I do support that legislation, and I hope that the Congress will support it as well one day.
Okay, Mr. Attorney General, really great to have you with us. Thank you for your time. That's Keith Ellison. He is Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. Coming up, the MTA in New York is facing an unsustainable revenue squeeze. We talk with its head, Janno Lieber, about what can be done. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. If you live in or around New York City, you care about the MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, because they run our subways and so much of our buses and everything else and the way we get around the city. We welcome now the man in charge of all that. He's Janno Lieber, Metropolitan Transportation Authority Chair and CEO. So, Mr. Lieber, thank you so much for being here.
Good to be with you.
Everybody's going to care about what you have to say right now. Everybody's certainly within the New York City area. Let's start, though, with this so-called congestion pricing. We have this environmental assessment that's come out now that would charge up to $23, as I understand, for people to come into lower Manhattan, to the lower part of business section. Where are you on that? I mean, where does that process stand, and what is your position on it?
Well, listen, right now we are going through what is a federally required environmental process, as you said. And what comes out of that process is then going to be evaluated by an expert panel that we created to figure out what the tolls should be and what the exemptions and discounts should be. For example, there's a provision of the law that created congestion pricing that gives a tax credit for low-income people who live in the lower Manhattan district. So they're going to have to balance those things. More exemptions. If we give more exemptions for whatever reason, the tolls will be higher. But the bigger issue is we need congestion pricing, because just as climate change is an existential issue for all of us, and this will help us to deal with the pollution and make New York even greener, so is the fundamental existence of a city where you can get around. Right now, we are choking on congestion. We cannot get police vehicles. We can't get buses around. We can't get accessorized paratransit around. We can't get all that Amazon e-commerce around. So we have to do something about it. The legislature said we were going to do congestion pricing, and we're moving towards it in the next year.
But you're in favor?
Yeah, I mean, our role is we have to be somewhat neutral as this environmental process unfolds. But the legislature has made this program part of our capital program. It's supposed to fund $15 billion out of our 5-year capital program, so we're counting on it.
That's just where I was going to go. How does this fit into your business plan overall? As I understand, this would raise, we think, $1 billion a year.
And that, David, that $1 billion is meant to be bonded into $15 billion total for our capital program. So that pays for maintaining that 100-year-old system, the basic structure. It will pay for buying new subway cars. It will pay for making the whole system ADA accessible. It will pay for electric buses so we have even less pollution. We need that money, and we're counting on it.
Yeah, things that no doubt we need a lot. At the same time, you've also got an operating expense issue. I mean, quite apart from that capital issue, you've got a big shortfall here. How big is the shortfall?
Well, I say to people, we're an $18 billion business that's lost 40% of its customers. Now, we're way up from where we were at the beginning of COVID. At the beginning of COVID, we were down 90% on the subways, 95% on the commuter rails, and we were losing $200 million a week. Right now, we're way up to over 60% of pre-COVID levels, but clearly it's going to take us a while to get back. We need a new financial plan that will help to fill that gap because transit is really existential for New York.
Well, so let me ask you, you're up to 60%. That sounds really good. But I'm told that a lot of other big metropolitan subway systems are doing better, like Paris, for example. Why is New York behind? Is there anything you can do to fix that?
In Europe, they are doing a little bit better. They're a little further along in getting people back to look. What happened in New York is people got very accustomed to a lot of remote work. Return to office has been much slower, but we have done, return to office is only at 40%, but we're at 60% because we have so many other New Yorkers who rely on mass transit systems. So trying to cut our way out of this deficit is really important because transit is like air and water in New York. It's existential. People need it to survive.
But let me come back to what the hole in your operating budget is. Yes. Put aside capital budget. How big is that hole, and how much time do you have to plug that hole? I mean, there seems to be some urgency to this.
Well, the federal government had 3 COVID relief bills. The third one, the ARPA bill that President Biden put in motion, and Chuck Schumer really looked after the MTA throughout this whole period. So we ended up with $15 billion. It's a lot of money to fill that hole, but it runs out in 2025. Based on our projections. So we do need to find a new plan that will make sure the MTA is funded and we can continue to support the city's economic recovery after 2025. Our proposal is that needs to start in 2023. We think you can actually reduce the structural deficit if the legislature takes action then.
Well, I was going to say, you can't wait to 2025 to address it. You say you want to start addressing it in 2023. That means you got to come up with a plan in the next 6 months.
Yeah, and I think the first step was what we've done in the last few weeks, which is to put out a new assessment of what the financial the projections were going to be and what the gap was going to look like. We did that. People are starting to pay attention. We wanted to seed that discussion among the policymakers and thought leaders. That's been accomplished. Now, by the time the governor is what we expect to be the governor's reelection, after that, the legislature will come back to Albany and we'll start to get into it.
Anybody who's run a business, and you're running a really big business, knows that when you have a problem like this, there are a couple of ways to address it, and typically you do both. You try to raise the revenues, but also cut the costs. What about cost cutting? Where could you save some money? And let me ask you specifically, what about service? Could you cut back some? D.C. has a pretty good metro system. They don't run it at night.
Yeah. Well, listen, fundamentally, we looked at during COVID, there was a period of time when we were intensely cleaning in the middle of the night, and we actually cut it back, and there was an outcry. There are so many people in New York who rely on mass transit because they don't have automobiles. Remember, more than half of New Yorkers don't have access to an automobile. So a lot of folks who are especially in hospitals and otherwise, who were stuck on the late shift said, no, we need 24-hour service. It's kind of in New York's DNA. But there are ways to save money in our operations, and we are attacking that. I've given our operating teams like hundreds of millions of dollars of goals in different areas. We're going to bring that to the table as part of our discussion with the legislature.
You mentioned that working from home is hurting your ridership.
Yes.
For those of us who are living in New York and watching the evening news, for example, crime seems to also be deterring people. How big a factor is that really? Because every night almost on the evening news, it feels like we see something happen on the subway, which is pretty scary.
Yeah, and listen, there have been some really high profile and really alarming crimes that have definitely upset people and changed some folks' view of transit. But I think that the bigger issue is not that crime has gone up so dramatically, because overwhelmingly the subway is still a safe place and New York is still the safest big city. But what we're hearing from our riders is it's not just the actual crime, it's the sense of disorder, non-compliance with just the everyday rules, and also the presence of a lot of folks who are suffering with mental health issues in the public space. That's true on the streets in New York. That's sometimes true in the subway. the issue of mental health and disorder in the system as big as crime, and we're trying to attack it. The mayor has been great on this issue. The governor is coming in behind him, doing a ton of work on the mental health stuff. I'm optimistic.
So, Janno, finally, put this in a bit larger perspective, because one of the real goals of so many people in New York City, particularly the business community, is to get people back into the city, get them back into the office. What role does the MTA play in helping get that done?
Absolutely. We want mass transit. Listen, mass transit is one of the things that makes New York affordable. It makes it possible for people to make use of the amazing range of activities and theater and culture and excitement in New York. We want to support the city's economic recovery. I do believe there is value in in-person work. I accept that there may be hybrid work. We're planning for that, but we just need a new economic model, because in New York, unlike many other places, as I say, mass transit is existential. You cannot, in a city of this density, which is twice Boston, Chicago, and 9 times the density of a place like Houston, you have to have mass transit, and it needs to operate regularly, and we have to fund it.
Mr. Lieber, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Really appreciate it. That's Janno Lieber. He's Metropolitan Transportation Authority Chair and CEO. Coming up, President Trump faces a raft of legal issues, but could they help him in another run for the presidency? This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. A fair amount of this week has been consumed with following the legal travails of the former President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, first with a search warrant down at his home in Florida, and then coming up and taking the Fifth Amendment in a deposition yesterday here in Manhattan. To bring us up to speed on exactly what he's facing, we welcome now Zoe Tillman. She is senior reporter with Bloomberg News covering law and politics. Zoe, great to have you with us. So give us how it looks from President Trump's point of view. He must have an awful lot of lawyers on his Rolodex right now.
He does. It's an ever-growing list of attorneys who are being brought on. I think it's not only multiple matters, it's multiple states, it's multiple investigations. The most urgent, pressing one this week was the search of his home at Mar-a-Lago in Florida during what we understand to be an investigation into whether presidential records, possibly classified materials, were improperly taken from the White House. They're supposed to go to the National Archives when a president leaves office. There are strict protocols, especially when it comes to handling classified materials, and a raft of criminal charges that can come with destroying, hiding, mishandling documents that belong to the U.S. government. There is separately an ongoing investigation into the January 6th insurrection, whether the former president played a role in that could expose him to criminal liability. He is already facing potential civil liability, which maybe puts him on the hook, not for prison, but financial penalties, a ruling from a jury or a judge saying that he was responsible for the violence at the Capitol. There's investigations in Georgia into his role in pressing conspiracy theories and trying to secure some fake slate of electors. There are civil investigations into his business. Defamation cases. Yeah. You name it. It's out there.
Yeah, President Trump spent a fair amount of his career in some sort of lawsuit or the other. I'm not sure if he's too worried about damages, and obviously criminal liability is something else. But there's also this, I must say, I thought obscure statute, federal statute, that suggests that perhaps if he were convicted of removing or destroying documents, he could be barred from running for president. That might really get him where it hurts.
That's right. Although, legal scholars who looked at this during the controversy over Hillary Clinton's emails, when Republicans thought that perhaps this statute might prove to be a bar to her run for office, have largely concluded that between the Constitution and the U.S. Supreme Court, it's unlikely that even a conviction for this offense would stop someone from running for president, that the Constitution lays out the qualifications and disqualifications for running for president, and it's unlikely that this particular law could stand in the way of that.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Bloomberg's Zoe Tillman on President Trump's legal issues. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and also online. Coming up, we'll have a second hour of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio. Please join us. This is Bloomberg.